Welcome. My name's Tasha Fiddy. I'm coordinating the lecture series this semester. Welcome to the fourth, this is very loud, welcome to the fourth of our Spring 2014 lecture series. Before I introduce the speakers, can I just acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that we're meeting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay our respects on behalf of you and myself and all of us to their elders past and present. Just for future reference, we're videoing tonight and it'll be up on YouTube, I hope, in the next couple of days. If you're interested, last week's lecture by Tim Williams from the Committee for Sydney is already up, and there's a link to that in, on the UTS architecture.net blog, so have a look at that when you can. So can I introduce Professor Anthony Burke, the head of school here in the School of Architecture, and I'll let him introduce our guest speaker.
Thanks, Tash. Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Tonight's a bit of a sort of a different lecture for us than our usual sort of chalk and talk version where we just get someone who's amazingly fabulous with the practice and they just go through project after project after project. What we thought we'd do tonight, it's really an opportunity for us to introduce to both students and staff here at UTS as well as our colleagues in the professions in architecture and landscape architecture, to introduce you to Karl Kullman, who's our new course director for our new landscape program. So we're incredibly excited about our landscape ambitions here at UTS and the launch of the program earlier this year. So we're off and running with a cohort of about 36 students, which is fantastic. They're all already into their second semester. And we're about to have an open day on Saturday where we hope to get our next batch of students to come in for the next year. So we're looking at it as a sort of a really important next, I suppose, intellectual plank in the offerings of what we are talking about here at UTS, mostly around issues of the city, and how then landscape has become a central figure and a central player in any kind of conversation around urban issues or the city itself. So it's very important to us that landscape is a big part of our school and who we are. So with that, we've got Karl Kullman who's here. Simon Kilbane up the back there is also just started recently here, and he's our other landscape offering, and we'll roast him some other time on a spit somewhere in public. But so tonight, Karl's here. Karl's here for the week. He goes back to Berkeley where he's currently teaching, where he'll be finishing up at the end of the year, and he'll be back here in December to start the job properly. So we've been strategising all week, talking about what's going to happen in our second year next year. Just a very quick intro. Karl, Western Australian boy, went to be educated at RMIT in Melbourne, went back to Western Australia to teach for a bit, then went to Berlin. Other way around. Then went to Berlin on the way back to Berkeley, yep, where he's been for 7 years? Six years. 6 years now, yeah. And if you know, of course, the Bay Area, I used to teach at Berkeley as well. It's a beautiful place, and it's also Berkeley has an excellent reputation for their landscape program. So Karl has been in excellent company for 7 years, doing some amazing work there, of which we're about to see some. So Karl's going to give us an introduction to him, his work and his thoughts around the program. Then we're going to have a quick conversation at the end of that, and we'll ask the floor for questions and answers, and we'll see how we go. Karl, thank you.
Yes, Berkeley is 101 this year, and this program is well, 0. So there's I'm really excited about the new possibilities of the symmetry of not having the baggage of having 100 years of accomplishment behind you. So it's a clean slate. I think the format is that I'm just going to give an introduction to some of my work for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and then we're going to go for a kind of Q&A, and we're going to get to hopefully the crux of the actual theme as it was posted for the lecture today. What I've done is just choose 3 projects from my body of work from the last 10 years. I've been living abroad for 10 of the last 15 years, so that internationalism will be reflected in these projects. I chose them for their connection to urban issues. They're all, urbanism is embodied in them in some way, the forces and processes of urbanism. The first one on the left is from East Germany, so it involves processes of urban decline, which some of you may have worked in that context. It's an incredibly difficult environment to work in. We tend to be extremely growth focused in all the work we do. It's always about development, improvement, progress. These are all very modern ideals. Working in the context of decline is goes against all the things we're taught and learned. We don't really have urban decline in Australia, but we do have rural decline, and some of you may have worked in that context. Certainly in Western Australia, there's a lot of rural decline. And it seems to me like landscape architects are often hired as the profession of last resort or something in those contexts. When everything else is exhausted, the landscape architect gets hired to try to make sense of what is left in a place that's declining. Second project is very much not decline. It's all about growth in China, or the mass building in preparation for growth. And the third project is also about growth, urban growth in the periphery of Perth. So the first one is set in Leipzig. Leipzig, like all of East Germany, when the Iron Curtain came down, there was mass population exodus. A whole bunch of people decided they didn't want to live there anymore. There wasn't the jobs for them. And there was sort of a mass flow of people out of East Germany. Leipzig was the kind of the sort of node for mass decline because the industries that were there really shut down, the textile industries. East Leipzig, where this project is focused on, was even worse. And the figures, I don't recall the figures offhand, but they were sort of Detroit-esque in terms of the degree of decline. You know, areas with 50% population loss. And that's what that looks like when you actually do it. And there's still buildings like that there now. To cut a very long story short, so that I don't take hours, there was a great deal of investment to rebuild and to build new accommodation. If you build it, they will come. And there was an attempt to get millions, there were targets set to get millions of people back into these cities. At some point in the late 90s, it was accepted that wasn't working. So actually the targeted deconstruction of the city would start to occur, so that you take something like that, which is the sort of pre-war structure of Leipzig. Incidentally, in the red is the site that I'm going to get to, and you start to deconstruct it. So you densify parts and you deconstruct other parts. Red in that diagram is densified, green is deconstructed. There was a system of green links that were proposed, and then the park that I'm going to talk about was to be in the end of one of those green links, essentially like a knot at the end of a green link. There was a proposal then to use, I don't have a slide, but to use vacant lots and to appropriate them for public use, to plant them out, to do it incrementally bit by bit. The site itself was once completely filled with buildings, traditional sort of Berlin block style buildings with courtyards. That's how it looked prior to the project. So in the Soviet era, post-war and then the Soviet era, it was sort of deconstructed anyway. And there was a lot of buildings with big setbacks, schools were built there, sports fields, but it was very disparate. So the project called for some kind of unification of that site, but also to give it an identity that in somehow might, and this is where it gets complex, deal with the process of decline, either through reversing a little bit or bootstrapping it or something to at least make the area immediately around it feel like a better place to live. We proposed, and I should acknowledge Lutzu Sieben, the firm that I was the lead designer at in Berlin in the early 2000s. We won the competition proposing an incredibly simple idea, but a beautiful idea, a loop that would unify all the disparate areas. Then a process of clearing out trees, remediating soil, all the things you have to do in a place like that. That went through a process of detailed design, was refined. The narrow bits got wider, the wider bits got narrower, and we refined it so it's exactly 1 kilometre long. That seemed to be important to have that kind of incrementalisation. For some reason, people love loops. It's something sort of you can switch off. You can sort of switch off your orienting faculties and just kind of let you release yourself to the path and you go around, and you know you're always going to end up back where you started. You sort of don't have to make decisions. As a lifelong runner, I always like to head to the hills and make my own path, but a lot of people just seem to like to go around and around and around, and we were playing on that with this design. It then, over quite a long phased period, was constructed, and even the final construction was finished after I'd left Berlin, because it did take a long time to move through all the parts. It was then built. I've returned a number of times to do a kind of informal analysis and observation of how it gets used and how it's impacted the surrounding area. I'd have to say it hasn't impacted the surrounding area at all. It's still very, times are really tough there. There's still that kind of outflow. There's like a flow of people around the loop, but there's an outflow of people going to other parts of Germany and other parts of Europe as part of the wider, European project. So it has all these moments where you move along it. The white line is precisely 1 kilometre long. It's like the marathon line in the Olympics, where it's, if you run on the line, you do the precise distance. And it goes in and out and weaves and ducks. Wherever there's some kind of function or use that's tied to it, or a need to cross, we've played on the zebra crossing motif, and that's stenciled on. I've then become very interested to see how people use it and move around it. And this is actually Lynch and Appleyard's famous proposal for a freeway in Boston. This is a diagram of how you would experience it, how it sort of narrows and widens, and where you see views and so on and so forth. And I've always been struck by the kind of similarity that wasn't in our minds when we designed the kind of literal, the literal manifestation of that in the ground. What strikes me, though, is we designed it to be used in 2 ways, so that you can go both ways, and it's incrementalised, 800 metres, 200 metres, go either way. It's very strange that everybody uses it almost in a counterclockwise direction. And I sort of did some research to find out why that may be the case, whether it's sort of the Coriolis effect, or whether it's right-handedness, or it's just a social norm, and it appears to just be a kind of social norm. That hasn't always been the case going back in history, but the vast majority of parks, athletics tracks, of course, ice skating rinks, we just move in that way. So people just automatically approach it and turn to the right as they move around it. Changing places completely now. The second project is for a garden design for a horticultural exhibition in Xi'an in China. I was invited to do this along with a team that I formed with a couple of graduate students and along with several other Northern Hemisphere universities to design gardens for this very large proposal to make a horticultural exhibition, which tour the world, and they've been, they used to just be about flowers, but they've become so much more than that now. It's a way for a country to kind of present itself like a Olympic Games or something like that. It's a way for a district to use the investment to, again, sort of bootstrap itself and provide focus for development. So the garden show was but a small part of a massive development, which you can see in the background here. And this is actually the site that we confronted when we went there for the site visit. That was then turned into this huge project in an old mine. I think I have a pointer. Yep, that's the site just there. The site, it's no bigger, it's only 250 square metres, no bigger than a residential lot. It was one of many. I should say our own Vladimir Sitter from Sydney also did one. West 8 had one. Topotech, one of my favourite firms from Europe, had a brilliant scheme as well. I can point you in the direction. I'll give a reference at the end if you're interested in following those up. We became fascinated with the idea of reverse flow of water. There was a local myth or a local story about the river flowing in the reverse direction. Generally in the Chinese imagination, rivers flow from west to east, from the highlands to the lowlands. This river, the way the dendritic pattern works, flows in the opposite direction. Of course, it's not cheating gravity, it's just that it flows east to west. So we started to play with the idea of reversal of flow, reversal of water, and then the splitting of water, which also goes against the natural tendency for water to converge. Dendritic, that word I just used, is the convergence of water from a rivulet to a creek to a river to the ocean, or to a delta in the end, into the ocean. So we were working with themes then of tying water to, say, the idea of time and a passage through life, and if you're not talking about convergence but divergence, the idea of choice as opposed to something being predetermined and fatalistic. We then worked with the idea of water and paths being together, so that runnels or rivulets of water and footpaths moved in unison through what became called the Garden of Forking Paths, which some of you may know the famous Burke story and of the same name, which was not a physical garden but a book, and I guess I was referencing that too. The idea was that one path becomes, well, about 30, that there's a bunch of choices to make. It's a form of labyrinth in a sense, but it's not a closed labyrinth. You're never going to get lost in it. It's always easy to find your way out. These were early 3D models of it, of how you might move through it, and where you start to make the choices. You can see the water rivulets there, and as you emerge out of the canopy and then confront the lake. Another 3D model, sort of model to look a little bit like a physical model of looking back over it. This deconstructs the layers. The kind of critical layer is the bottom one, which was the very complex topography that we worked out for it. And then you can see the layer of the paths, the rivulets, the planting, which we'll see in a second didn't really get done, and then the trees on top of that. Documentation, it's easily the most complex thing I've designed and documented. I wouldn't do it again. At the time it was just an academic exercise. We weren't expecting these things to get built, but then suddenly it was on, and then suddenly they were being made. So it was not a fluid process. It's not like we knew every step of the way. This starts to give a stronger sense. This is actually the planting plan, but it starts to give a stronger sense of the form of the forking of the paths. The giant octopus, as my grad students call it. Then, in the chaos of the building site, this thing started to get built. And from that, you know, children and just bits of steel and twisted, the thing started to take form. You can see on the left the kind of massing of the steps and the walls that were down near the lake. I actually like what we see there. It sort of looks semi-ruined. I actually like that more than the cladding that we'll see in a second. On the right is the beginning of the construction of the rivulets. You can see the form language has changed a little. We couldn't construct the curves that you saw in a previous diagram. If I go back to, those curves couldn't be constructed, so it became a sort of more angular scheme in the end. Then this is the kind of the grand moment of the entrance, when you go through a bamboo frame and then you're confronted with the choices to make. It didn't quite work out because they did everything really well, did the levels well, did the finishes were pretty good, but for some reason just didn't do the planting at the end. Which was kind of hurt since if anyone's familiar with China, there's boulevards, miles upon miles, which have immaculate planting, and you know, this would have just been a fraction of that. The main unit is this. This is the cross-section of the rivulet. The flat piece with the overhang was to hide some lighting underneath it, which is only in some parts. In some parts it's raised, and in some parts it follows the water flow. You'll see that through a bunch of slides that I'll just crank through. That slide's a little out of place, but people then did start, it wasn't expected, but they started placing stones and rocks to control the flow of water. So it actually became interactive when I had no anticipation that that would occur. You can see here there's one of the runnels starts to rise up. Of course, it all has to flow with gravity, so nothing's actually rising. It's just that the path is falling away faster than the rivulet is falling away. Another view of that. And some of the complexity down the end where the paths and rivulets have all separated, and they're just kind of two systems now. Another view of that. And then starting to look back up into it. The next view shows the one rivulet that really held its level all the way from the top, and then that spills down, and then they all just flow straight back into the pond, and then it gets recycled as a system and comes back out. looking under that, and where it moves into the water, and then a final view across. Okay, I'm on schedule. The final project is a larger pure research project that's still underway for me, and I've received quite a bit of funding to do this, and this is based in Berkeley and in Perth, Western Australia as well. And this comes from the observation that somewhere in the last 30 years, we lost the ability to build on a sloping site in suburbia. And what's called benching in Western Australia, it's called mountain cropping in California, is a kind of product of a bunch of things that I'll talk about, of standardisation, where we now go to extraordinary lengths to reshape the landscape to accommodate flat land building typologies. I became very interested in that because it creates absurd situations. This is just the northern suburbs of Perth. That's quite normal in Perth. People just just don't bat an eyelid to that. And I started to wonder, how did that happen? Where was the moment where that happened? I know we just blame concrete pads. That's the easy thing to do, but it's actually more complex than that. Levelling in itself is not a bad thing, of course. We associate levelness with usefulness. We need a level place to sleep, for example, at the kind of most fundamental phenomenological level. So there's nothing bad. We use it for agriculture, but I guess it's when it's on the scale of suburban development, when a slope like that in Berkeley becomes that to accommodate a housing development, there's a sense that there's a loss of connection of natural processes of placemaking in terms of how we dwell in our landscape when we're on a completely artificial surface. In Perth, I've done a lot of work there. It's an excuse to go home, of course, and to go windsurfing, but that's another story. And I've investigated where the moment is of that transformation. This is this matrix, a little bit hard to discern, but basically it moves from the 1930s down on the left and then down again on the right. So the newest is bottom right here. Decade by decade, the way suburbs that were developed in each decade, I analysed the degree of topographic modification, and that required sort of reconstructing topography from old maps. It was quite a lot of work to find that information, given that 1 metre contour intervals are a quite new thing. And the local mapping agency destroys all their data after 5 years, which is unbelievable. Somewhere where you can see, somewhere Ocean Reef in the 1980s is where that disjunction starts happening. It starts a little bit in the 70s, but it really kicks up a head of steam by the 1990s and 2000s. There's several reasons for it. One is perhaps the lack of flat land. I mean, that's more obvious in, say, Los Angeles or San Francisco, where it's very much the flat land, and then it really just kicks up into the mountainous frame very quickly. That's all been filled out with suburbia. What do you do then? You start pushing up at suburban densities, medium suburban densities, up into the mountains. So that's one reason. In Western Australia, there's not, there's still plenty of land because you could just extend ad infinitum, but it's pushing into dune areas of complex sand dunes that would have been avoided previously. One of the reasons for that is because property prices are worth so much. Another big factor is plot ratios, so increasing, bigger houses, smaller lots. It's a, convergence. In the old days, a big lot with a small house, you could move it around and turn it and twist it, and it sat on a plinth and there was room to move. By the 70s, starting to flesh out. There's lifestyle programming that we start to use our backyards for functional things rather than just waste and growing things and whatever. So we start terracing, and then by the 80s, essentially the plinth that a house used to sit on is deferred to the property boundary. Lifestyle programming, as I said, indoor, outdoor, all these influences were also important, and the concrete pad. I'm working at the moment on a site, studying a site north of Perth and Burns Beach, where there is a proposal to develop this wonderful piece of fore dune and secondary dune sand dune topography with a incredibly standard model to terrace it. The example on the left is not there, it's a little bit further south, but that's what it will look like as I've constructed here when they model it. They will basically just scrape it clean, and they're already doing it. You can see in the aerial photo it's beginning. What I started to do with this project was to look at it from a pragmatic point of view and say, well, we're not going to, in the culture of the local politics, a single tower is not going to be an option. That's just doesn't work there for various reasons. Working at, say, medium densities and then putting aside pieces of land for, nature reserves is not going to also work, because there's a culture of building at these densities and a culture of fully detached houses. So I wanted to understand whether it's possible to reconcile topographic sensitivity with medium density housing as we do it at the moment. So I've looked a lot at how we can, different building types, and a lot of going back to historic norms as well, and what are the implications of them on that site. I've worked with a grid using different versions of terracing, of the retaining walls. Actually designing layouts that respond to the topography, which we used to do, and a lot of the older suburbs do, like running roads along the swales does actually make a huge difference in terms of the topographic, retaining topographic sensitivity of the place. Trade-offs of maintaining, say, a ridgeline at lower densities and then just doing standard practice on the rest of it. Is there a kind of give and take? Maintaining swales. This is in sand dunes, as you know, a swale is the kind of low points. The water goes straight down in Perth because it's not like here it has to run off somewhere. It just goes straight in. There's no creeks. It just goes straight down. So the swales have often been, they're treated as holes. They've been filled with rubbish. They've been filled in. The idea of this proposal was to actually see if you could retain all the swales, all the hollows within a site. And I'm not going into detail of all the pros and cons because I don't want to take up all the time. I will say, to finish that though, one very simple conclusion from all that is actually terracing is still better than what they are doing at the moment, which is just now just completely removing everything and saying we're doing it without terracing, but that's because there's no hills left at all. And I guess essentially, as long as the cost of moving earth around is cheaper than the value of land, unfortunately that's an economic reality that needs to be dealt with through policy and good design. I'm just going to wrap up my little talk now, but if anyone's interested, being an academic, my job is essentially to write, so I have written about all these projects, and these are all hidden behind paywalls on subscription, journal sites, so you can email me, and if you're interested, and I will send you a copy. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl. Can you leave one of those slides up?
Yep.
So we've got some of your work there as a background. Yeah, that last one actually.
Last one?
Kind of like scary enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll terrify everybody. Great. Thanks for the talk. We've got a pretty heavy agenda here because we're supposed to come up with the future of landscape architecture. So I'm glad there's an audience because it's all going to happen here tonight, right here, right now. Where I wanted to start was with some observations, I suppose. Gerard Reimers and I were asked to speak at a conference at the Canary Islands about 2 years ago, and they asked us because we were Australians, and they asked us because there were no other Australians going, and they asked us to speak because it was about how the Canary Islands were reimagining themselves in their own landscape and their own futures. And we were supposed to represent Australia, so we put a lot of thought into, well, how does landscape in Australia and national identity relate to each other these days? This was right after Julia Gillard had just pipped Kevin Rudd off the post because the mining tax was so controversial. And so politics, the landscape, mining, industry, national politics were all in the mix. And what occurred to us, I suppose, was that the idea of who we are as a country in Australia had really shifted through how we identified with ourselves and our own surroundings. So from a version of the surfers and the beach battlers and the bush battlers, we'd kind of come around to a point where everybody in their evening news was seeing BHP, huge mining trucks, trundling along on these open-cut mines and saying, you know, that's how we're imagining our landscape. It's gone from this beautiful thing that we sort of identify with in this sort of bucolic way into something which is productive, which is tied to national economy and success in Asia Pacific and all of these very big things. So the idea of landscape in national consciousness, I think, has undergone a fairly radical battering, or at least a shift recently. I wanted, from your perspective in Berkeley for the last 7 years, knowing that background and especially knowing these types of projects where economics are really forcing their hand into what we'd think of as an otherwise, you know, creative and aesthetic discipline like architecture in many ways. There's this idea that the landscape actually is, I don't know, suffering, or it's changing, or it's evolving to accommodate these, you know, massive political and economic agendas. How do you see that working?
I think it goes back to there being two perceptions of landscape in Australia, and it goes back to the hollow continent. The idea that we kind of cling to the edges, and we turn our backs away from the centre, and so we do the mining out of sight, out of mind in the centre, and then the kind of the pretty stuff, the beautiful stuff that makes our lives seem better, we do around the edges. So there's actually a dualism going on there. In terms of the perspective from Berkeley, as Australia just gets never, well, let's just say it this way, there is some incredible landscape architecture happening in Sydney, especially at the moment, and I'm not just saying that to appease my hosts. I regularly say that and use examples all the time in my teaching. It is completely undersung and not acknowledged at all. Part of that's because Australia just doesn't exist to, say, the US or to Europe, except for, you know, occasionally a feel-good story about surfing or something like that. And partly is because perhaps we don't sell it as best we could. We are getting better at it. There has been some good books coming out lately, but there's still maybe a little bit of a cultural cringe there in terms of not realising how good some of this homegrown stuff is at the moment.
I suppose that leads to my next point, is I think from our perspective, I suppose we've seen the conversations in the city changing fairly radically with a whole new bunch of stakeholders, if you like, getting involved with city making over the last, say, 3 decades, really. Yeah. And it's got to the point now where I think it's really interesting that actually someone like Charles Waldheim can come in and say, landscape is urbanism, full stop. He's made that claim, he's written it down, and he's published it a number of times. So there's this kind of, on the one hand, this incredible renewed faith or hubris or confidence in landscape at the moment, which is sort of being written now into this city project, which is a part of, you know, everyone's talking about urban densities and all the rest. So, but landscape architects seem to have done an incredibly good job of inserting themselves as the necessary sort of linchpin, the glue, if you like, that holds things together. While everyone's squabbling around the rest of it, landscape seems to be the sort of like the centre of the pie. And it's done it sort of in a very clever way in which it sort of says, yes, we'll just gently orchestrate everybody. Why do you think, I mean, am I just sort of seeing something weird here, or is this actually happening in your mind? You know, is landscape becoming this sort of central consultancy?
Yeah, yes and no. I think firstly it's a compelling idea that instead of that cities, we do no longer understand cities as being made of building blocks of stone and, you know, figure ground, you know, white spaces for streets, the kind of nollie map, the traditional new urbanist or the traditional urbanist way of doing it doesn't describe the contemporary disorienting expansive milieu of the city, and that landscape does the idea of landscape as a metaphor for a city is a much better way of describing the emergence and change and all these kind of things and the ecological nature of the city. So I think as an idea, it's incredibly compelling. I'm not so sure that landscape architects have done as good a job. I think it's an incredibly, what I see is less, and I can't really prove this, but I see less a kind of collaborative environment, but it's actually more of a competitive environment in a sense that everybody's interested in the landscape, but landscape architecture is only one part of the people who are interested in landscape. And so people are coming at it from different directions, and it's actually getting it's becoming a bit of a crowded marketplace, I think.
Mm-hmm. I guess with that too, don't you think, well, I mean, we've seen things like placemaking become a separate, again, another carving off of a piece of work that is city making. And whatever happened to the urban designers? I mean, where did they go? I mean, at some point, it as a discipline seems to have sort of stepped to the side a little bit. So if there are any urban designers in the room, I apologise in advance. But it seems from where I'm sitting that, urban designers don't have an accredited degree, and yet landscape has moved into that space in a very interesting way.
I could bring it up, but I've got a Venn diagram. If you do the classic diagram of architecture, landscape architecture, say city planning as the three kind of orbs, and then the unification of them is urban design. That was the kind of classic model of it. In reality, well, it's been said well enough that, say, planning has moved away from spatial operations, kind of abdicated that and moved more into policy. Architecture or urban design has then moved down more into planning, and architecture of landscape have kind of moved into fill the void. And then landscape urbanism is sort of in there as well between architecture and landscape architecture. So it's more of a migration, I think, of similar issues but different fields taking them on.
For those of us who aren't in landscape, can you explain what's going on then with the landscape urbanists versus the new urbanists? What's happening with that tussle? Because that seems like there's some pretty vitriolic rhetoric going backwards and forwards between those two camps.
I've just been asked to write an article on that, actually. I actually think it's a false kind of battle, I actually think what it all misses is a loss of localism and regionalism. That's what it all avoids. They're both spoken about as kind of global systems, as one thing. But the urbanism here is different from the urbanism in Europe. The landscape urbanism is different as well, and I think that's a really important point. And that's that sort of sense of localism gets completely missed in this obsession with this battle between the two.
So with that sort of on the table, I suppose, how do you then see landscape architecture as a discipline? How do you see it evolving into this new context? Where is it changing?
That's interesting. I mean, there's sort of three parts to it, because there's landscape, then there's the profession of landscape architecture, and then there's the discipline of landscape architecture. I think the discipline has been able to move into the area of city making quite well. I mean, I know the profession is doing a very good job at it, but it's far more complex to actually do it on the ground. So it's a longer game, I think. The idea of landscape itself is actually far more fraught, because it's bound up in the picturesque and scenography and all that. And that sort of gets missed a little bit, which is why...
But isn't there a new urban picturesque that's being built in Darling Harbour right now?
Right, true. Which is why maybe landscape urbanism has fallen out of favour a few years ago, and ecological urbanism is, the metaphor that the GSD now prefers.
So, well, what other skills then are you seeing that landscape architects are taking on? Where is it evolving?
It's essential that they understand cities intimately, and how they work and how they function. The idea of landscape just being on isolated sites is long gone, I think. Most of our work is in cities, and they're now so complex that they need to understand that. I also think landscape architects need to, getting into education now, need to improve their core skills as well. That needs to get better just on the pragmatic side, to kind of be able to level it with some of the other professions and talk the talk better.
Do you think, I mean, it sounds like you're sort of talking more about political skills, economic skills, those kinds of, advocacy type skills. Drafting or crafting? Drafting skills. Grafting skills. Yeah, that'd do well in state politics. So, well, I guess you're sort of putting out there a position where again, in my mind, there's the traditional landscape architect out doing land stewardship, management, sort of big sorts of open tracts of land. And then there's this other landscape architect who does things like the goods line, the goods line. Is it getting to the point where you make a choice? Somewhere in your career you say, actually, I'm committing myself to the city, or no, actually, I'm committing myself to more rural.
It doesn't have to be that way, and I think the essence of these ideas of landscape urbanism, that it's not, is that they all are similar issues irrespective of scale. Landscape architecture, as many of you know, has suffered from this dualism between landscape planning and landscape design that's sort of been around since, McHarg and prior to that. Scientific analysis was for large sites, and art was for small sites in cities, and one was sort of more rural and one was urban. But that's all over now. So there shouldn't be a choice that you have to make. The skills should be transferable.
So what's the single most important thing you think in an education of a landscape architect these days? What is it? It's sort of There you go, putting you on the spot now. We haven't written the curriculum properly for the third year yet, so this is your opportunity to sort of say it in public.
Well, I just said it. It's urban. It's understanding urbanism. That's essential.
Right. So more urban design theory, more urban design practice, that kind of skills. Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose with that, I'm going to throw to the floor a bit and open up for some questions if anybody has some to keep the conversation going for another sort of 10 or 15 minutes or so. Does anyone want to jump in with a question for Karl?
I have a microphone.
Tasha has a microphone and she's not afraid to use it. While we're waiting for some brave soul to put up their hand, I just want, you talked a bit before about the perspective of Australian architecture from somewhere like Berkeley. Where do you look around the globe then for your, I mean, apart from Sydney, of course, which as you mentioned, where else are you looking and seeing the best examples of this kind of work happening?
It's interesting. I don't look to the US. It's, okay, there's the High Line. It's like there's only one project in the US, right?
Well, I've never heard of it. Can you tell me a bit about that? No.
It's out. Oh, that's the goods line. Landscape architecture is actually extremely conservative in the US, and it sort of, falls back into a folksyism a lot. So I look far more to Europe. And I mean, since Barcelona 1992 Olympics reset the agenda and moved the focus away from the US and put it firmly in Europe and said it is not just grass and trees, but it is these things in a city, and it is urban, and it doesn't have to have anything growing in it. And they just really revolutionised it. We're still sort of in that era in a sense. I still look to them. I just actually toured right through there and through Germany. Germany is doing some amazing things in terms of working with water and remediation. And then Scandinavia always, Denmark as well. The Dutch, of course, yes.
Any questions out there? Well, keep talking if you don't have any questions, which is going to bore the tears out of you. Huh?
I actually had a question about the Perth project because how much of the change, how much of this is really driven by pure economics? I mean, it seems to me that these suburbs weren't designed for anything but economic gain.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge part of it, but you have to control economics through policy. I mean, if it was pure economics, it would be even worse, I think. So there is some attempt to control it, but actually view is a big part of it. View, the idea of having a view, and that's worth so much. And I didn't mention that, equalising the view so everybody gets an ocean glimpse. I mean, you guys know it from the harbour, right? It's the same kind of thing, but instead of buildings popping up and chopping trees down, you can actually control the landscape and level views. And as long as everybody values an ocean view, that's an incredibly powerful economic force that has to be fought against. There are little initiatives that they're trying along the way, but they're still only demonstration designs that are happening.
Well, with cities like Berlin, when you were working in East Berlin, and the sort of cities in decline, it's an interesting other side of the coin. I always think of Detroit as the classic example of a city that's sort of shrinking and really struggling with its own identity, its own urban scape, if you like. And in that context, we see a lot of projects which are sort of very wonderfully utopic about gardening in the town and bringing the farm to the city and all these sorts of things. And every student at some point in their academic career presumably does a sort of a city farm. Yep. It's good, everyone gets it out of their system and they can move along. But I wonder with something like Detroit and other cities in America, there's also this idea that sort of landscape just sort of fills in, and it goes, it's almost like it's a remedial, it's always on the remediating side rather than on the sort of the productive or the progressive side. I'd say there's other counterpoints here. You think, the landscape has invaded the city here. There's Patrick Blanc across the road and things like that are going on where landscape is redefining its role in the city itself. But generally speaking, would you agree with that characterisation that landscape tends to take this sort of soft remediating touch?
I think it is, and it has a lot to do with grass because of, the fact that it just does grow there and it just sort of fills through everything. Of course, in in Detroit, as you know, figures can be don't tell the whole story because actually the Detroit area has grown and it's the hollow. If this is the hollow continent, that's the ultimate hollow city. It's just the core. Everyone's moved out beyond 8 Mile or whatever it is. It's the core that has been vacated. they're actually turning it, there's actually a lease now to start broad acre farming there. So they're actually, the city is finished in a sense. And it becomes a question of when you get over the nostalgia of it, do you put it as a placeholder and try to maintain the urban form for maybe a return later, or is the future just elsewhere? I mean, there's plenty in history of civilization, cities rise and fall, and do we just get over it and accept that it is different, and the economics of the US is, everything's moved offshore and it's different now.
Which actually gets me to the China project. I mean, I suppose that is a project. It's more of an art piece in a way,
Yeah.
like it was a smallish project, but one that had a very intense aesthetic dimension to it. That seems to be a very projective idea. And you spoke about it in very material terms. Here's the rivulet and here the concrete, and we missed out on the planting, but we got the trees. But it also seems to have this sort of conceptual dimension that's driving some of your work. Where do you find that? How do you make that connection back to this, for example? Like, this is, in some ways, hard sort of surveying and geography, or I don't have the right terminology for it. It's topography. It's analytical. It's very numeric. And yet, the Garden of Forking Paths is a whole other dimension. How do you start to combine those two things?
This is the beauty of landscape architecture. It's poetic and it's analytical. It's both. I know poetry can be a bit of a dirty word, but in design these days, but it's still very close to my heart in terms of actually feeling design. It's a little bit old-fashioned, but I change hats at will in that regard, and it's that's the beauty of doing it. But I still always want to understand how it works within the bigger system. Hence the attempt to understand the urban processes around it, of the why they built that there. Because they were building, 20 skyscrapers at the same time.
We were looking at some projects from, landscape projects from around Sydney earlier this afternoon. And what struck me when we're looking at the drawings of those projects was just how technologically supported contemporary landscape projects really need to be. All sorts of, sustainability and technical dimensions to the drainage and retention and these sorts of things, as well as incredibly intense sorts of sustainability plans for planting and these kinds of things. So while, as a non-landscape architect, I look at those and I enjoy those spaces with my kids and so on, but what strikes me is just looking at the underneath of those, that thickened layer of technology just seems to be forever growing. Do you think there's a point where, I mean, in architecture that got to sort of like immensely thick walls, and now we've gone back to sediment and we're all trying to get thin. But at one point there, it was like how much do we need 4 feet of insulation to keep the cold out when we're in Scandinavia? And that bloating of the technological wrapper of architecture. Do you see the same sort of thing happening with landscape? It's sort of celebrating its own technological prowess, perhaps a little too, I don't know,
that's a really
candidly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I guess, it is. Is there a turning point where it does get too much?
Do you ever find yourself thinking that's too artificial? It's a bit too Centre Pompidou, but hey, I've got trees, so it's all cool.
No, nothing could be too artificial. That's not a very good answer, I'm sorry.
So what do you think? That seems to be a growing trend. Would you think of that as in that way? I don't normally put technology and landscape together in that kind of way, but it seems like it is incredibly growing
I think
dimension.
anything then is better than veiling. Well, I mean, I guess it still has a role occasionally, but landscape architecture has this long history of being the veil, the most resistive, traditional of the arts, and it's the veil for all the other stuff and the other disciplines. It screens them on the ground and on the surface, and anything that strips that veil back is a good thing. And a landscape system that is honest and reveals itself is a good thing. So maybe there is no end point to that. There can never be too much thickening, perhaps.
On the other side of that ledger, you were saying to me before this that you visited Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson very recently.
Yeah.
Yeah. How amazing / disappointing was that? And what did you learn once you actually went and saw it? I mean, we all know the image, right? Which is there it is. It's over there. Seeing it there like that, what surprised you about it?
It was a lot smaller than I thought, and as you can see, the water's gone right out. But what it actually was it was a reason to go into that landscape. And so it actually, you look at it and go, it's not in the water anymore. Do they rebuild or do they not? What do they do? But it was actually then you look up and look out and look down and see the salt lake and all the things going on around it. So it's just it was just a convenient, in the end, a convenient lure to get me to a place that I wouldn't have gone before.
What about the Getty?
In
Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles. I was a little bit intoxicated the one time I went there, so I don't remember. It was after a conference.
I was drunk at the time,
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
I'll get back to you on that one. Yeah, ask me another question.
I've got a question. Sorry. I'm really curious when you're speaking about the spiral jetty in terms of a kind of instrumentality in the way that it introduced you to the landscape. It asked you to see the landscape in a particular way or the environment. And I want to take it back to Anthony's question a little bit earlier about the role of landscape urbanism as a more powerful, in terms of a more powerful instrumentality. It's not a passive object toward which one gazes, which it has been in the past, but it becomes a much more active instrument within urban renewal and urban regeneration. Can you speak a little bit about that? Because I was curious in the Leipzig project that you showed when you were saying it had no effect.
Yeah.
And of course we expect these projects now to have some kind of regenerative effect.
Yeah, we want feel-good stories, but my point was that the forces were so strong that it might have had a little bit of effect, but it was counterbalanced by such strong forces. Maybe in time it will have an effect, I don't know. Maybe slowly things will start to turn. Maybe I was there, last time I was there was a couple of months ago. It hadn't at that stage, so maybe it...
Because the High Line has certainly had an effect.
Of
I mean,
course.
I think there's no denying for all of our sort of tiredness and exhaustion and it being referenced all the time.
I mean, it's paid for itself many times over in terms of the property values and all that.
But even in that context, we were sort of talking earlier that these kinds of projects, they exist in media, you know, and so actually the dependency of many landscape projects today is actually not visiting them so much as how they circulate, you know, online and all the rest of the images that are set up. So it's a very cinegraphic sort of approach, all set up for the iPhone quick shot, you know, or the Instagram moment. And so we're probably much more aware of more landscape projects, and yet, you know, one of the things about the lightning field we were talking about was you're not allowed to take cameras. You have to book in, you have to go there, you're introduced, there's only 2 or 3 people there at a time, they give you your meal, you have to spend exactly 24 hours there and you can't record any of it except to be there and present. And yet that whole myth, you know, is sort of staged around that one fantastic image with the lightning bolt hitting the, you know, the aluminum rods. So where do you see, you know, the image making of landscape fitting into the picture of the discipline as a whole? Is it a good thing or a bad thing, or where do you see it heading?
I think it's both, because we're just talking about scenography, and the image is, you know, is the one point, the kind of the moment is in a way a bad thing. Yet there's certain practitioners, Topotech, and also Grossmax, Elko Hoofdman up in Edinburgh, who actually make you know, their practice is sort of the image based. They do work and they manipulate an image and then they make the landscape reflect that, rather than pushing things around on a plan, organising things the way we're kind of taught is a good thing to do it. They do it through the image itself. So there is that way of working. It's a broad church, you know. On the other hand, too much of it in the wrong situations is just a violence, a bad thing.
Can the sublime exist in a Pinterest website?
Possibly.
Possibly.
Yeah.
we'll
it's not
see.
going to have that transformative effect, though.
Maybe not quite as as religious as an experience. Well, I think we'll let you off the hook unless there are any other questions from the floor. Yeah, Tom.
Thanks for that, Karl. I'm interested in the little bit about the mining and our kind of what's behind us. You know, the mine. I was in Berkeley not long ago, and the student did as a graduation project a beautiful thing in the Butte copper mine, you know, the biggest hole in the world, which is empty and unused now. And it was this really beautiful, elegiac idea about standing on the edge of something that was over, you know, this kind of extraction economy. I just wonder if you've got an inclination to turn us around.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a tough one. I mean, there's the rock in the middle. There's Ayers Rock. Oh, sorry, Uluru, and we occasionally turn around for that in our kind of minds. But as a culture, we're all, you know, we're just all on the edge. It was Bernard Salt actually who made the hollow island point. But would I like to? I mean, I guess so. We should. I mean, the reality is most of us have never been beyond, we live within a few kilometres of the edge, and most of us have never been to the centre. So I guess we should all go there.
Karl, James Wirick from UNSW.
How you going?
Welcome to Sydney, Karl.
Thanks.
It's great to have you. And I congratulate you on really beautiful work that you presented this evening.
James.
And I also thank you for the conversation, which has ranged widely, and it's based upon, I think, very, very deep thinking and a very great sense of where you're going and where you're taking landscape. I think that ultimately, if I can get what came out of some of the questions and perhaps what's behind them, is that there's a celebration of the work itself. I think there's now a convincing body of work of landscape architecture achievement in this city and across the nation. And that has not come from nowhere. It's come from a culture of landscape architecture, which was the great conference of '91, for example. I think that if I interpret what Anthony was saying about looking at the work itself and looking at the way it's documented and understanding the mode of practice of how the practitioners that we admire are able to work in this tough scene of our own city and so forth. And I think that it lives, obviously the urban is something which has been very important to us, but and we see that as the site of challenge and the site of essential transformation that needs to happen. But I think the thing in landscape architecture is not necessarily urban as such, or to do with the larger landscape. It's really a way of thinking, and it's that incredible capacity for synthesis, as you said, between a poetic and a powerful technical basis, but also the overall synthesis of a broader cultural expression in the living world and in living systems, and how that gets transposed into complex projects. I think it's that process that is the core of what we need to understand of what we're doing.
I think that's beautifully said, and as you know, the landscape is everywhere, which makes it such a wonderful medium, but a difficult medium too, because we're sort of using the material of the world around to then make artifice. On the other point, I think it's time for a new book, perhaps, of landscape architecture in Australia. There's been several recently, but then maybe as a more definitive one.
I mean, if you just look at the documents, I mean, setting aside the logic of Mr. Keating's park, which is insane, of course, but just looking at the drawings that JPW produced for it, it supports what Anthony's saying about the level of technical finesse, and then many of the other practices, of course, McGregor Coxall, Aspect Studios, Jane Irwin, we could go on, and the established practices, Tract and so forth with their long record. I think the body of work is really remarkable, and everyone in the room should celebrate it and go and see the great spaces and places in this city.
I agree.
I agree, James. You've curated to a large degree the success that landscape architecture is enjoying in Sydney at the moment. So we've got, as you say, some amazing practices that seem to have gone from here to just have gone like this, and everyone is looking. Why do you think that is now?
I think that it does build upon a very long campaign. I've been involved in this for a long time, and so the pioneers of the field had very strong views of what they were doing and went out and did it. I think that Karl mentioned Barcelona. Barcelona was a way of thinking again, or a way of acting as well, that influenced us. I was teaching at RMIT at the time, and in the late 80s we were aware of what was beginning to take place in Barcelona. And Manuel de Sol Morales came out on a couple of occasions to Australia, but he was certainly there in Melbourne in '91. And I suppose the point of all of that is that there's a dominant culture which produces these suburban environments and the great holes in the ground of Australia and so forth. And then there is a resistant culture which has got a greater idea of what is important, what has to be done. And the story of the great urbanists of Barcelona was that they understood their own city, and when the chance came, they did it. They were able to do it. And again, it's perhaps a rather trite comment, but when Alex Washburn was out here from New York City, who was behind in many ways the High Line in terms of an urban development proposition. I mean, his mantra is very simple, that urban design happens when politics, finance and design come together. But that's in fact when all designs happen, to build a building, to build a landscape. And so knowing what to do when those other two come together is what everybody who we educate has to be effective at. And so it's a lifelong study to know how to act when the opportunity comes. And I think that that's what we want to prepare our students to do.
Speaking of that, you've just celebrated 40 years, haven't you, at UNSW?
No, we counted it as 50, to be honest.
50?
No, the graduate diploma in landscape architecture, people like Ken Ma, Wei Chong, Craig Burton, Helen Armstrong, Neville Gruzman, all did that. That started in 1964. And our undergraduate program opened in 74, our first graduates in 78. We have had some research degrees over those long periods, and a number of people have come back, our own students come back and done doctorates and research masters. And we briefly had a Master of Landscape Planning as part of that divide between design and planning, which happened in the 90s. It was a very, very good course. It combined GIS, landscape ecology, cultural landscapes, and in that triumvirate. But it was very difficult to position that. See, one of the unfortunate things that happens in the professional world is all of these fiefdoms and professional definitions. I think they're not very helpful at all. The larger question is what has to be done, and who, and bringing the right people together to do it. But so we weren't able to keep a post-professional landscape planning viable, sadly, very sadly. But we have taken...
Congratulations on 40 years, well, 40 plus.
Yes, well, I've had, my own personal experience was to come back to Australia. It's great to come back to Australia from overseas. I was away for a very long time, and to teach in Canberra initially, and many of the great graduates from that program, of course, Adrian McGregor, Kath Rush in Melbourne, Mike Horn, so Sue Barnsley. And then to teach at RMIT with Jim Sinatra, and nobody had a greater commitment to the continent than Jim Sinatra has had. And then the privilege of being at New South Wales all these years. So it's been a wonderful journey for me. But we welcome UTS. There was a course at Sydney University that Alan Corrie ran, which was, again, a terrific landscape education, really using the resources of Sydney University with its depth of botany and ecology, going right back to the 1920s, those researchers, and the geography school of that time. And sadly, he wasn't able to get the support of the Institute to survive, for that course to survive. So I think that what has been achieved in our field has been really the work of individuals with a passion. Right. And I sense that's what's happening here at UTS, and I really congratulate you on doing it.
But that's a pretty good way to end. Karl, I'm going to give you the last, or the second last word, and just sort of say, well, you're about to arrive in December. What's the first thing you're going to do when you get here?
Go windsurfing.
Yeah. I thought it was go to work, log in. No, okay.
Yeah, go to work.
Well, I think we're all agreeing that actually landscape is having a fantastic sort of time of it at the moment, and with the renewed energy that's in the Institute right now, we've been getting an amazing level of support for the new course. We're really looking forward to working with colleagues at UNSW, so I'm really thrilled that James and others are here. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
And with that, we're going to stick around for a little while if you're going to ask any questions of Karl. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you at the next public lecture. Thank you.